Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Max Minutes on this Friday morning. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to joining us today. For those of you joining us that I have not had the opportunity to meet, I am Jackie Joyce. I'm President and CEO of Career Rise. And as a board member of Max and co-chair of Max Minutes with Amy Lancaster King, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Max Minutes on behalf of Max. So before we begin today's program, I wanted to take a minute to recognize our Max Anchor partners. Your investment in Max extends beyond financial support, and they allow us to really be able to bring collaboration across employers, workforce organizations, and community partners. And their commitment allows us to be able to bring conversations like this to you in our community. So thank you very much to our partners. So our agenda today, we are going to have Rebecca Hunt from the University of Georgia Carl Vinson Institute talking to us a little bit about Georgia's demographic trends shaping the workforce. We'll have an opportunity for a Q&A. So as you guys are listening to Rebecca's presentation, feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll make sure to ask Rebecca those questions, time allowing, throughout the presentation. And then at the end, we'll have some closing remarks, just to remind you all of some things that we have going on at Max so that you can be sure to be in the know and participate in things that Max has going on. So Rebecca is going to talk about some demographic information. So behind every workforce trend is a demographic trend. You have population growth, migration, labor force participation, changing pathways that all shape the folks that we serve as individual to find work, identify where talent is located for our employers, and really allow our workforce system to really visualize what work can look like 5, 10, or even 20 years from now. And so Rebecca is going to share some data with us. I had an opportunity to hear Rebecca talk about data at the Southern Crescent Technical College Summit a couple of months ago, and she did a really great job of really being able to bring that data to life and help us think about what do some of these numbers mean as we start thinking about workforce development. So it is my pleasure to bring Rebecca to you all so that she can share some really great information and data with you guys. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names and friends on the call, so excited to be with you all today. I will say, as I was preparing for this, for those of you who know my boss, Greg Wilson, he said, just use the snapshot, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And I said, Greg, I bet you there's gonna be a lot of folks who have seen that before. So there are some pieces from our annual snapshot, but also pulled in some new data that we've been thinking about. And so I'm glad I did because a lot of you have seen some of this before, but hopefully there will be some new nuggets that will be useful for you all moving forward. So as was mentioned, my name is Rebecca Hunt. I am a public service faculty member and the unit manager of our workforce and economic development team at the Institute of Government. I have been at the Institute since 2017 in a full-time capacity since 2018 and have really started as a labor market data analyst and have just really kind of stayed rooted in that as I continue to do work across the state with communities, organizations, agencies around workforce development. So I know most of you are familiar with the Institute of Government, but for those of you who are not, we are one of 8 public service and outreach units at UGA. And that really stems from our land grant mission. We are the state's land grant university, and that means that we have this kind of responsibility to be out across the state connecting locals with the research and the teaching that's happening at UGA. In the case of the Institute of Government, that really looks like working with local governments, state agencies, communities, in a variety of ways. Sometimes that's training, sometimes that's technical assistance. For my group, that is really a focus on workforce development and labor market data. I have the privilege of working on a really great collaborative team that also includes an applied demographer and several applied economists, which means you're going to get a little bit of everything today. Our team works so well today. But really, when I think about what we do, I think our mission really speaks to it well, and that's to inform, innovate, and inspire so that governments can be more effective and responsive. And so, whether you're truly like a state agency, I saw some folks from TCSG and DOE, or whether you're somebody local or working with a nonprofit, helping you be more responsive and address current and emerging needs is kind of the sweet spot that we sit in. I love working at the Institute. I love working with data. And one of the pieces that I have been involved in since 2019, when we did our first workforce conference, was the creation of our workforce snapshot. As I think about how we share data with folks, we've got a wide spectrum of people when it comes to data. Some people love it, want to stay immersed in it, want to do decision making with it. Other folks, it can be really overwhelming. And so we in 2019 decided to put together kind of what are some highlights. It was really well received, and every year since then, we have done the same. So I'm going to share a few pieces from this. And then also, like I said, some new pieces that we've been looking at. And then at the end, I will share we've officially announced our date for 2026, our conference, and we will be releasing this year's snapshot there. So would encourage folks to get registered for that. I'll share the date in a little more detail at the end. But with that, this is kind of how the next little bit's going to flow. So I'll start with some demographics. A lot of this, I will say, is about a year dated because the population projections are currently in the midst of being finalized, the updated ones. So we should see those released in the next few weeks. But we don't have those publicly available yet where I could share them. So I'll be sharing some there and talking about kind of what tweaks we may see moving forward. One space that we've been having a lot of conversation about is labor force participation, the rates there, and kind of barriers. And then I'll just do some high level at the end education. And then we've been really trying to play around with the data and figure out how we talk about AI in a meaningful way. So I just have two slides there that are some things we've been thinking about. But we're going to continue to work in that space on the data side over the next few months to be able to share more at the conference. So a little bit of a deep dive on demographics here. So, between 2010 and 2020, Georgia was only one of four states with population growth of over a million. You'll see up there with Texas, California, and Florida. Those states have stayed growing with the exception of California. It has actually changed course, and is losing population since 2020. But those others have continued to grow. And the ones that have actually replaced California are some other southeastern states like South Carolina and North Carolina. And so Georgia has continued to stay in that top five. And actually, in the first half of this decade so far, we've already added over 570,000 new individuals. So we are well on our way to another million in this decade if things kind of hold. We do know, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, there's been a lot of policy changes that may impact kind of how folks come into and move around the US. And so we don't necessarily suspect that it'll continue at that really, really fast clip that we've seen, but we do expect that Georgia will continue to grow as I'll show here in just a moment. So on the policy side of things, there's a few things that make up like kind of how a population changes. You've got what we call natural increase. So that is the number of births minus the number of deaths. And so that's that black line up there. You see in the last 15 years or so, a pretty significant decline. Obviously, COVID, we had a lot of deaths, but for the most part, births are down, and I'll talk about that in more detail. But the other two pieces that kind of make up how folks change and how the population changes is by domestic in-migration or out-migration, and then international immigration. So that red line is domestic. I mean, sorry, the red line is, yeah, domestic. And then, nope, I had that backwards. Um, so you'll see that like our international immigration is actually been kind of down as policy changes have kind of limited that. And that's something that our team, as we're thinking about projections, is really thinking about like, what does that mean for us? Domestic immigration, folks moving around the US, has been pretty high. We're seeing a lot of folks coming into Georgia from our surrounding neighbor states, as well as major population centers like California and New York. And when I think about that and I think about the workforce, and for those of you, especially in Metro Atlanta, um, that means you're likely working with more and more folks that are not from Georgia, right? We've got a lot of folks that have family elsewhere, or maybe moving whole families here. But one reason that I'm kind of looking at on that side is why folks are moving. And so some of them are policy related, some of them are political. I think, we're pretty similar in a lot of our states around us. But one thing that we have seen is things like military pensions being taxed or not taxed, things like state income tax. A lot of our surrounding states do not have an income tax. And so if you're right there on the border, it may benefit you to kind of move into another state. So we see things like that and political changes right now driving a lot of why folks are moving, which is something that we haven't necessarily seen as much in the past, which is really interesting. Another piece is around kind of cost of living, which the Southeast has typically been quite a bit below some of these other places. Obviously, Atlanta, not as much anymore, but these are some things that we're kind of monitoring and will continue. Across the board, the good news is population is growing, but where that growth within our population is, is something that we're really keeping our eyes on. So on the screen here, you'll see the total Georgia population. So we've got it back to 2000 and then projected forward to 2040. And we have three kind of big buckets here. So the bottom, that dark teal, is under 25. So those that are kind of our younger folks in our citizens and those that are in education or maybe starting to enter the workforce. That light blue is 25 to 64. This is what is federally called the prime working age. And then the darkest one at the top, age 65 and over. So you can see the bars are getting bigger. We've got growth in population overall, good thing. But as you can see, we have not a whole lot of growth in our under 25 population. Some kind of steady growth, but nothing major in our 25 to 64. And the majority of the growth in Georgia's population is coming from that 65 and over. That is both older individuals moving into Georgia, as well as individuals that moved to Georgia when they were younger, aging into that bracket. That is not just folks moving in that are over 65, but thinking about, a lot of our workers that have just kind of aged into that. When we look at this, so this is just sheer numbers. When we look at that by percentage of the population, this is where we start to see some concern. In the last few decades, it has hovered around or been sub 10% of the population was over 65. That was a pretty manageable, we've got a lot of folks in the workforce to take spots of folks that are retirement eligible. But as you see in 2020, we hit about 15%, and by 2040, we're expected to be over 20% of the population being over the age of 65. And that percentage of youth has slipped sub 30. And so that's something that we're continuing to monitor. And that's not just in Georgia. Across the country, we're seeing a higher percentage of the population over 65 becoming retirement eligible, et cetera. So, y'all have probably seen either this slide or something similar in the past, but we're continuing, and I'll be curious to talk with our demographer once the population projections are released and see if there's any major shifts here. But if anything, I think it is more of a shift towards the over 65 than a shift in the other direction. So I talked a little bit about birth rates and those being on the decline. This is one of our graphics that was in our workforce snapshot. But fertility rate is down in the US, most developing countries, and in Georgia. Um, and so this is looking at the total number of births based on the mother's age. And so you've got the dark teal is 2007, and then you've got the bright blue is 2022, and then the lime green 2023. You can see that overall, the decline there, we're seeing less births. And then we're also seeing a shift to the right, which means that more of those births are coming to mothers who are older. We have seen a really big reduction in teen pregnancies, that first group, that under 19. That's a really good thing, right? We're not having a lot of teenage moms that aren't finishing high school dropping out because they've gotten pregnant. But that means that we now, one, have less babies, but also things have shifted. And that means that what folks are looking for in work, if somebody is already in their 30s before they have kids, they're likely already established in a career of some sort. And that changes the dynamic on workforce, what they're looking for in work, and their desired need for childcare. If you're somebody that's kind of entry level and you may have a little more flexibility versus somebody that's older and more established, more senior, and is really kind of maybe in a more executive role, that can be hard to step away from. So that's something that we are continuing to monitor as well, and really think about the implications there. I'll talk a little more about childcare and that piece in a moment. But I'm going to shift gears a bit to labor force participation rate, and some barriers there. And you'll see very quickly how it's hard to separate this from the demographics, which is why I kind of started there. So this is labor force participation rate for the state of Georgia. And this is the headline that a lot of folks are talking about right now, that we are at close to a historic low for total labor force participation. We're at about 60%. And that, to a lot of folks, is a very scary headline. That means that we've got 40% of individuals over the age of 16 that are not working or actively seeking work. And that's maybe scary. But there's some good news within this, and you'll very quickly see why this number does not scare me like some folks may be concerned about it. First piece of good news, we have less discouraged workers. In the last 10 years, we have seen a pretty significant decline in those that are considered discouraged. And so the BLS defines this as someone who is not in the labor force, but they want and are available for work. So they just are discouraged. They don't think there's a job out there for them. So they're not actively looking and they're just sitting on the sidelines. So you see that we were up, 28,000 at some point. We are now down, below 20, close to 16. And so that's a really good news. We've got a lot of folks who are saying like, oh, actually, I'll keep looking. And I think this data in particular, at least somewhat rebukes the conversation that folks just don't want to look for work right now. There were a lot of folks that were discouraged for a while, and that's not necessarily the sentiment quite as much right now. As for why that is, right, the economy right now, things are really expensive. And so that's obviously helping folks feel like they need to work. But this is kind of a longer term trend. Folks are finding good opportunities for work. The other piece of good news is that despite that labor force participation rate being down, we have a historically high number of workers in Georgia right now. Pre-pandemic, we were around 5.2 million individuals working in the state of Georgia. The most recent data is pushing 5.5. So we really have added a lot of individuals to the labor force since the pandemic. And that's a really good news story. Obviously, a lot of we talk a lot about how Georgia has been the top state to do business for so long. There's all these new opportunities. We're adding more jobs. Really good. So this kind of feels like it's at odds with that first piece of data. And so a lot of folks have been saying, so like, what's going on here? Why is that first headline so scary? And this is really what it boils down to. I know there's a lot of numbers here and there's a lot of math in the back end that helps me explain this, but really that first number was for individuals 16 and over. Okay, so that 60% number is 16 and over. If we look at 25 to 64, that prime working age, those are bolded in the middle, you will see that that labor force participation rate is right about 80%. That's a really, really good thing. We've got the vast, vast majority of individuals that kind of should be working are working. And so that first number, that total labor force participation rate, is down because of this demographic piece. If you look at 65 to 74, and then you look at those over 75, those numbers are down. And as this population grows, it's going to continue to drive the overall labor force participation rate down. And I think we can all agree, but that by the time we hit 75 or 80, we probably don't want to be working. And I don't want to be included in the labor force participation rate because I don't want to be participating in the labor force by the time I'm 75 or 80. So to me, when we look at this, when we talk with communities, we are always focused on prime working age because a lot of folks get hung up on how can we move the needle on labor force participation rate. And I would argue that rather than working on that overall number, we should dig into these numbers a little more and figure out where are there pockets that we can really make movement within this kind of prime working age group. So I pulled a little more detailed data for the state of Georgia. And here's a few kind of pieces that I see as potential kind of areas. And a lot of these are folks that y'all probably already work with or are aware of. But when we look at labor force participation rate for that 25 to 64 based on educational attainment, we see that those that don't finish high school are less likely to be working. If somebody gets at least started in college, they're over 80%, right? We've got a pretty big jump there as folks pursue some sort of post-secondary of some sort. So that's one piece as we think about completions and getting folks equivalency for high school. That is a really big thing that can ensure or tends to ensure folks are more connected with the labor force. Another piece is around this child issue. And I'm talking a lot about this, one, because it's something we hear about a lot, but two, I have an almost 2-year-old at home, and right, you feel I'm surrounded by folks that are in this stage of life and thinking about what does it mean with the economy right now and with jobs and everything to work or not work, and childcare is really expensive. But the data suggests that across the board, generally, parents are more likely to work once their kids reach school age in Georgia. So, what you're seeing here, this first column is kids under the age of 6. And then we've got children that are 6 to 17. And so you can see that if they are living with both parents, those parents are about 4 percentage points more likely to work once they hit 6. And 6 is the age there because that's public free education. And so they aren't having to pay for that early childhood education. Obviously, there's some nuance within if only one parent is working, a lot of kind of family choice happening there. But if we look at those that are living with one parent, and in particular, the more common one is that they are living with a mother, there is an 8 percentage point jump once those kids reach school age. So to me, this speaks to the fact that yes, there may be some folks that choose to stay home because they want to be home with their kids before they go to school. But we also likely have a number of individuals that cannot afford or cannot find reliable childcare that works with their work schedule. And so they're waiting until their kid hits school age in order to um, kind of pursue the labor force. So this is some data that we're continuing to dig into as well. We have some survey data that also supports some of this. There was a new survey stood up post-COVID that asked households based on just some like what were some current issues going on. So in late 2024, which was the last time this question was asked of individuals in Georgia, there was about 200,000 Georgians that said during this 1 month survey period, they were not able to send their child to childcare for some reason. And when we look at that group, they were then asked, well, what did you do about it? And so obviously some just said, I cut my hours a little bit or I used paid leave. But for those that maybe didn't have quite the flexibility in their job or the benefits in their job, a number took unpaid leave. But the number that is just startling to me is 21% of those individuals, which is about 42,000 individuals, said they left a job completely because they could not find or could not send their child to childcare for a short period of time. So that's a large number of individuals, especially when we're talking about the number of jobs coming into Georgia right now. And something that we're continuing like thinking about, how do we think about short-term creative childcare that helps solve situations like this? The other thing that well, I've got two more slides around kind of barriers, and this one isn't so much a barrier, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least briefly touch on housing. So affordability continues to be an issue for a lot of individuals in Georgia. Here you'll see those blue bars are annual median income for some of the major industries in Georgia. And then at the top, you've got some dotted lines of what would be kind of the annual median income required to afford a one bedroom, two bedroom, three bedroom, or four bedroom. This is obviously across the state as a whole, an average. So if we're thinking about Metro Atlanta, probably a little higher even. Um, but one thing with this is that we really think about our one income households, and especially those that are early in their career. We hear a lot about how folks, get even a good job and still aren't able to afford a house for a while, whether that's because of savings, whether that's because of student loans, or really right now, just the cost of housing being so high that it really takes multiple earners in this economy to be able to afford housing right now. Um, and so our young professionals are feeling it, a lot right now, as are a lot of folks across the economy. Um, the last thing I will talk about on barriers, this is from that similar survey data that I mentioned with childcare. And I'm really bummed have continued this survey, but they've taken this question out. This was last done at the end of 2024. And to me, this was one of the most valuable pieces. We kept getting asked, why are people not working? And they recently updated the data, and I was digging through and I thought I was going crazy. But they have just taken this question out completely. But they used to ask kind of why folks didn't work. And so during the survey period, there were 2.1 million Georgians over the age of 18 that were not working and were not retired. And a lot of folks didn't report or gave other as their reason. But when we look at the top reported reasons, we can see that sick and disability was the number one, followed by caring for children and then caring for elderly or kind of parents and such. So care is still a really, really big issue. I will be curious to see if we get any updated data here, or we're actually looking for alternative sources to kind of get at this data right now, because this was something that we got a lot of questions about and really helped us answer a lot of those. So, I'm going to share three quick pieces of education data, and then I'm going to wrap up with some AI here. So college going rates are down across the country, and in Georgia over the last decade or so, we've seen a pretty significant percentage point drop there. And I think a lot of times when people hear me talk about this and they think that I'm talking about it as a negative thing, they see me with the red and black, and then I'm like, oh, post-secondary is not doing well. But the reality is, from my workforce lens, this is potentially a good thing. I think for a long time, we've really pushed folks going to college for everyone. But we are seeing a bit more of a shift towards college for the folks that want that, and that's the right path for them, but finding ways to get um, young adults connected to work or other opportunities for training, apprenticeships, etc. So this is something that in my mind is a good thing, as long as that drop is happening in places where there is good support for students finding alternatives to college. I think some of our districts across the state are doing a really good job managing what does college bound look like? What do other opportunities look like? Others have for so long been college for all that if folks are making that choice, they don't know how to support those students as they make alternative um, decisions there. And so that's something that we're working with communities across the state to say, what do you have for those students? What programs? How are you connecting them with employers? What does that look like to be really intentional to support those that are not going to college for a variety of reasons? So then the follow-up is kind of, well, what are they doing 1 year? So this is for the class of 2024. So they've been out a little over a year, and we can look at what kind of happened for our public high school graduates. So for the class of 2024, that was about 120,000 individuals. Almost 20% of those went straight to work. And then that's this bright red one. 6.2% were working with some sort of career tech ed credential. So they had earned something through a pathway and were then using it to work, which is a great thing. That here you'll see 4.3, that dark teal is private, 36% public, kind of a USG institution, about 10% going straight to technical college, about 10% headed out of state. And then this unknown for the state of Georgia is those that are working out of state, those that are not working or not enrolled in school, sitting on mom and dad's couch, not sure what's next. Um, Enlisted individuals, as well as potentially some of our undocumented students who we can't follow through in the data as closely. Speaking of following students, this is the last piece of education data I'm going to share. This is from the governor's, all of these have been from the governor's Office of Student Achievement. And this looks at for the class of 2018, and we've looked at that so we can follow them for a little while. This is what that cohort of public high school graduates did 1 year after graduation, 2 years after graduation, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 years after graduation. So by 2024, they had been out of school for 6 years. And we can see that about 60% of those individuals enrolled in some sort of post-secondary. TCSG, USG, in-state, out-of-state, public, private, didn't matter. They enrolled in some sort of post-secondary. And as we follow that through, obviously enrollment declines as folks complete. And so this light blue here is our completion. We see about 31% had completed some sort of post-secondary credential after 6 years. This includes a technical college certificate of credit, associates, bachelor's, any of those. And then you will see, about 9% had earned that CTAE pathway, and we're working with that. But we have 27% or so that were just working without any sort of credential. So this gives us a little bit of a snapshot of kind of what is happening with students. And so when we talk about this with districts, this is kind of state average, but really, I mean, a lot of our districts fall right around here, give or take a few percentage points in any one bucket. But we're really talking about not increasing those going to college or increasing the number of credentials, but just really thinking about conversion rate. So making sure that the students that are going to post-secondary are going and are being successful and are earning something while they are there. So even if this 60% is lower, but a larger percentage of those have earned a credential, that's a good thing. And so kind of thinking about that and thinking about how we get folks connected straight to work. So I'm going to wrap up with just a little bit of AI data, and this is so high level. We've been getting a lot of asks around how is it impacting the workforce? How is it impacting this industry? And the reality is we still don't have great data across the board on that. And rather than try and give half data, I just want to share a few things that we do know. So I mentioned that survey that was done in 2024. They did it at the end of 2025 again. And while they dropped the why folks aren't working question, they added a how are you using AI question, which is interesting. So on a personal kind of household response level, we see that most individuals are not using AI in any sort of robust way. The majority said that nobody was using it at all. And then a lot just kind of for brainstorming or fact finding, kind of just quick little searches on ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. So we don't see it like down here performing a task instead of hiring somebody. That was a really small percentage. Um, I'll be curious to see when they do this again with 2026 data if we see big shifts here. Um, but at the household level, it doesn't seem like it's having as big of an impact. But really, probably the piece that folks are more interested in is around industries. And I was just at a conference last week in Memphis with a bunch of researchers from across the country and also some data vendors. And we are a longtime Lightcast subscriber for those of you that know them. And they shared a little of their research. And honestly, as I was putting this together, I kept coming back to this that they shared. And so rather than trying to recreate my own graphic, I decided to pull in what they had shared because I think it is really interesting. This looks at AI adoption, so those industries that are adopting a lot of AI, and then where there are need for new workers. So you've got four quadrants here. In this top right, these are industries where there is high AI adoption, and still a need for new workers. So this is a potential area where we could be thinking about efficiencies, and this is kind of a great space. When we think about over here in this top left, these are where we're having high AI adoption, but the need for new workers isn't nearly as high. And so things like IT, right, we're hearing a lot of kind of entry level coding being replaced, and there just isn't a need for a lot of workers right now. Down here, we've got low AI adoption, low need for new workers, probably not an area where we're like super concerned right now. But the one that they spent a lot of time focusing on was this bottom right. And that is where we are seeing low AI adoption, but there is still a very high need for new workers. And they were really saying for a lot of these right now, if we think about healthcare, leisure, and hospitality and retail, is society ready for an AI nurse or an AI doctor, right? A lot of us are not. We don't know what that looks like. But these are the fields that we are seeing the most need for new workers. The turnover is high. And AI could go a long way in maybe fixing some of the workforce issues there. But figuring out what that looks like is the hard part right now. And things are really moving so fast in AI that we are having trouble kind of keeping up and figuring out what the best case is rather than we're just kind of throwing everything out there and seeing what sticks, which is why in certain areas, maybe that adoption's high, even though we don't need it as much. And we're not focusing on these areas where it could be more useful, but that adoption just isn't there right now, whether it's because of infrastructure, whether it's because of investment, whatever that may be. So I think this is a great way to think about how much AI is being adopted versus kind of skills there. They don't call out skilled trades, but I would also probably, you see construction kind of right there on that line. I would say a lot of our skilled trades also probably fall into kind of that low AI, high need for workers bucket in that bottom right. So we're actually kind of figuring out what does recreating this sort of data at the Georgia level look like, because I think we could get some interesting kind of nuggets from that. So that is kind of most or all of my data for this morning. I just want to do a shameless little plug for our conference. We are bringing in quite a bit of AI speakers this year. So that will be a hot topic for us. The conference is November 10th and 11th in Athens. We know that we realized late that this falls over a state holiday of Veterans Day, and we got a lot of state folks on the call. We hope you'll at least join us for one of the days, if not both. But registration is about to open in the next week or two. So keep an eye out on your email, or if you want to make sure you get that and you haven't received emails from us in the past, feel free to reach out to me directly. And I'm happy to get you on our list. Here's my email and my cell. If I can ever be of assistance to any of you all, or you have questions or want to know more about conference. I know a lot of folks on this call have been a part of our conference over the last few years or so. great opportunity to meet with kind of workforce practitioners across the entire state, across the entire ecosystem. We usually end up with between 300 and 350 folks, and it's a great time to be in Athens. So that's everything I've got for y'all today on the data and my shameless plugs, but I'm open to questions.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. Every time I listen to your data presentation, I think about something new. I have lots of notes that I took to just kind of noodle on as we start thinking about what's next for workforce development, given all of this data. I'm actually going to start with one of the comments that we have latest in our chat, since it's related to AI. And Cherie said she's curious about how the AI question might change now, since AI has come such a long way since June of 2025. And so I'm curious if you had a crystal ball, which I know you don't, but if you had a crystal ball, what might you think some of those changes we would think that we were going to anticipate, knowing that AI really has um, stolen a lot of spotlight lately, and really been implemented a lot throughout households and in work?
Yeah, as we it was a big topic at our conference with researchers across the country, kind of asking the same question. What really has changed? What does the data say? And the data it still isn't showing it like we were hoping. Even some other pieces, we've seen some layoffs, we've seen some of this, but none of them have been explicit about were those AI. Very few of them have been explicit about AI and how that's involved. The economy right now is also a piece of it, so it's hard to kind of separate those two. Right now, what we're hearing a lot about is kind of ethical AI, about learning how to really interact with AI. I was actually on a webinar for facilitators. I do a lot of facilitation in my job, and it was AI enhanced facilitation. And what they said is an AI is not ever going to be able to facilitate like an adult is, right? That like a human is. But you are likely to be replaced by somebody who has figured out how to use AI, how to more efficiently prepare for a new client, how to do these things more efficiently than somebody who doesn't, right? And so I think it's really understanding. We're seeing a lot of folks, it was just kind of throw everything out there. And I think folks are now starting to take a little bit more of an inward approach to say, okay, that's all great, but how does that apply to me? How does that apply to my work? How does that apply to my organization? What structures do we need to build? And so I think I hope we're seeing folks be a little more thoughtful about AI right now and kind of pump the brakes on just like general AI and think about what really makes sense for them. I know we've got a lot of school systems. We've got, even here at UGA, we're starting to roll out some training. And a lot of folks are wondering, well, like, what's the policy on AI? And I think a lot of folks still haven't figured that out. So right now, I hope we're kind of in an intentional space with AI where we're trying to figure out like what works for us, what works for our organizations, and that then we may see I hope some shift towards, okay, actually AI, yes, it can do these things, but it would really be more impactful if we put it in this space and we think about that. Like I went to my doctor the other day and he was like, "Do you mind if I leave my phone here? It's going to take notes for me." And at first I was like, "What?" And I got kind of like frustrated, but then I realized he's like, that allows me to be more efficient and then go back and like do other things that now I don't have to do.
Yeah.
And we had a whole debate in the car about it, but I was like, okay, I mean, everybody's on Zoom, right? They're loading their AI meeting assistants and stuff. So I don't know. I still don't have a crystal ball there, but I think right now I hope that we are in more of a like intentional inward looking space on AI to figure out what it means for our organizations and for ourselves.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense because as something new kind of comes on the market, right? You're going to have those early adopters that just test it out and figure out what's going on, how can they use it the best. And as more people adopt it, you can really start to think about and hone in on more specific, how is it actually being used? And you'll be able to then have that data to think about what have been some of those implications over time to give us more information of how do we adjust our training programs, or how do we think about how job descriptions need to change, or how do we make sure we're preparing our job seekers, or how do we maybe provide some tips or tricks to employers that might be having some hiring trouble. And we can say, well, we know that this employer used AI in this way, you might be able to use it as well. So I think that's great. We had a question from Paul. He talked about, he said most of us will eventually be over 85, hopefully. What can be done to leverage this likelihood, so that impactful work can be accomplished from this demographic? So one of the things you had talked about was that population was growing. And so is there a way for us to think about how might we be able to leverage that growing demographic for more impactful work?
Yeah. This is interesting because I think I we have been doing a lot of work. One of our clients right now is Division of Aging Services, and they're trying to figure out their next state plan on aging. They're trying to figure out what that means. And right, I've been in the room with literally hundreds of seniors over the last few months. And there are a lot of folks that say, I want to keep working. I want to figure out something to do to keep my brain sharp, to keep myself going, because just sitting at home does not work for me. We hear a lot of that end of the spectrum. We also hear a lot of folks that say, I've put in my time. I'm eligible for Social Security. We also know that changing the age of Social Security, right? Some folks are going to be forced to work longer just because of that. Um, I think we're one seeing this is a hard one, but I encourage folks to do it where they can, is keeping those folks on, especially for folks who've been in organizations for a long time. They have that just like capacity, that institutional knowledge. It's like, how do you keep those folks on as you train new leadership, as you navigate things as advisors, as other pieces that have that institutional knowledge and can help keep organizations there? So that's one thing. I know right now with the economy, it's hard to keep on extra folks that feel like they're not kind of core business. Um, that's one thing. And then I think we'll continue to see, that population just it's hard because you don't want to say, okay, well, everybody wants to work. And so that's something that we've been like, you talk to one group and they say, help me find a job. Nobody wants to hire me because I'm over 65 or whatever. And then other folks are like, well, I'm done. So I don't have a great piece there. I think creativity is the best thing we can do there. We're seeing a lot of folks go into one thing I'll note is this is kind of W-2 traditional employment. I think about some folks that I know in my network who have retired and have kind of opened their own consulting firms or have gone out as like advisors and that sort of piece. And those would probably not be in the data because they're kind of sole proprietor or working for themselves. And so, I think we're seeing more of those individuals, those kind of like niche things pop up. Those are hard to weather hard economic times. So finding jobs that those individuals can still have meaningful work that are not going to be like hard lost by a recession potentially, I think is the hard piece. But creativity for me is the biggest thing. I was scrolling on my Facebook the other day and I saw a local Chick-fil-A was hiring parent shift and it was like 7:45 or 8 o'clock to 2:30. And they were specifically targeting parents that had kids in school, and they're like, hey, come work for us in the middle of the day. We'd love to have you. And so things like that, or even thinking about like, okay, what does an ideal work day look like for folks that, you know, that sort of thing. So I don't know. I don't have a silver bullet on that one, unfortunately.
No, I think that's really interesting, and thinking about how you think about the untapped demographic and population within your area as an employer, and think about how do I tailor these positions to be something that folks would be interested in. I think that's a really interesting way to approach that problem, is kind of thinking about how do we structure work-life balance for seniors or for parents also. And then Paul said, yes, entrepreneurship for seniors for sure. Um, Patrick had asked about if you could highlight the value of engaging K-12 in workforce development practices and communities as a solution to current labor market challenges to secure the future of the state's labor force.
Yeah, so it's funny. It's really hard to show in the data, but that is something that across the state, that is kind of our bread and butter is working with communities trying to build those pipelines, K-12, post-secondary, workforce, and even starting really, really young. I mean, things like career exposure, we're hearing more and more about that happening earlier and earlier. Um, what that looks like, and literacy, and all of these are kind of workforce connected. And so that engagement as early as possible, and as deep as possible is so integrally important. And as I look around the state, the communities that are really kind of thinking about that, that network, that ecosystem as early as they can, is really important. And, I talked about that demographic, and that younger group is not growing a whole lot. That means our graduation classes are about to start getting smaller. 2026 was the expected largest graduation cohort in Georgia. And from here on, our graduation cohorts are going to start getting slightly smaller, um, which means less folks coming out, which means more competition for those graduates because there's just less of them. Um, so sometimes that's hard as a community to say, well, like employers are looking for folks, post-secondary is trying to get their like piece of the pie and all of this. But ultimately, I think sometimes we think it's like college or career. Everybody has a career at some point, right? Whether it's right away or whether it's after college or whatever that looks like. So working with our K-12 to get a really good idea of what's going on in our community, what opportunities exist. I know a lot of y'all are Metro Atlanta, but outside of Metro Atlanta and even in Metro, there's a lot of opportunities that students just have no idea they exist. And that's going to be the case even more so as AI and technology change things. So working with those students early, getting connected with them is really the best way for folks to build that talent, pipeline for themselves. I think sometimes folks, it's hard work. It's long work. It's not something you see the dividends of immediately. Investing in our middle school can be a hard pill for companies sometimes because they say, well, those aren't going to be my workers for 7 years or whatever that number is. Um, but I would challenge that one, you're probably going to get a higher quality kid when they come to you if they've been connected early on, and two, they're more likely to stay if they know that there's opportunity locally. Right now, we've got a lot of folks that say, "Hey, I'm going to go to Atlanta. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to do that." And I think there's still value in that, right? Like I left for undergrad. I was gone from Georgia for 6 years. I am back and I am 15 minutes from my parents, right? Like I'm back in my like kind of circle where I grew up, and there are a lot of folks doing that right now. And so I also would encourage folks to not get discouraged if a lot are leaving. A lot will come back, right? I think so. It might not seem like an immediate return on investment, but a lot of them will eventually come back. And so starting that early, making that connection is so important for workforce now and will continue to be. And the communities that do it well are the communities that are thriving right now. And if I had one piece of advice, I know nobody asked me this, but on workforce is on the education side and the community side, having a champion for workforce, having a point person. Because I think while workforce is a team sport, if you don't have a quarterback of that team that everybody knows is calling the plays, we're all still kind of doing our own thing. And yeah, sure, maybe the boat ends up going in the same direction, but if we have somebody that's actually calling those rows and we're moving, we're going to be a lot more efficient about it. So whether that's a K-12 person, whether that's somebody in the community, but knowing who that point person is at each organization and keeping those folks in regular communication is, I think, the biggest thing you can do on workforce.
No, I appreciate it. I do have one more audience question, but that was going to be my last question. So you've already answered the very
Great.
last question of our day today. My last audience question for you comes from Chuck. He says, how do we share how critical this is with decision makers around the high demand career initiative integrating IA ready pathways, since we know AI will replace entry level jobs and tasks by the end of the year?
The top state for talent, a lot of that data is based in occupational projections from BLS, from the state, et cetera. Those do not explicitly include AI. And so it's really hard to understand what those full implications are going to be. The other piece of this is, I think, that the initial swing was it's going to replace all entry level. But what a lot of organizations are realizing now is that if you replace all your entry level, you have nobody to promote. So that's where I think organizations being strategic about what actually works for them is so important, because that broad approach may backfire. So I would say with the high demand career lists and AI, just really understanding how AI can be incorporated into all of these. So yes, there is an AI pathway at the Department of Education now. Really, really great opportunity to get students exposed to that. But we're actually seeing a lot of folks figure out, like, that's great, but how do we incorporate AI in all of our pathways so that we think about what does AI in ag? What does AI in this look like, right? And so with that, the other piece that is really important is connecting our educators with business and industry so that because this is moving so fast, if our educators are only in industry every few years, they're not seeing this speed. They're not seeing what's happening, or at least bringing business and industry into our schools to say, this is how we're using AI right now in ag. This is how we're using AI right now in engineering. I think is the best way that we can equip our students to understand what AI is going to look like, and the realities of AI in the work that they're interested in. That connection goes beyond any of the data. It goes beyond any of that. I think right now that direct link is the best way that we can prepare students for the reality that they're going to walk into in the workplace, AI wise or other soft skills, all of these other things we talk about. Um, yeah, I think that's invaluable right now with how quickly things are moving, is connecting our educators, connecting our students directly with employers in our area and hearing firsthand what's going on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I see some of our state friends as well answering some of these questions in the chat to support some of the answers that you've provided also, Rebecca. So thank you so much
Of
for
course.
sharing the data, for answering all of our questions from our audience and from me as well. Just thank you so much for your time today and sharing your knowledge and expertise.
Happy to join y'all. This is always a fun group. And if anybody needs, I'll actually go ahead and put my email back in here. If folks want to reach out specifically, I'm happy to talk through any other pieces related to the data or conference or anything else. But thank you for having me.
Thank you. Right. So as we get wrapped up today, I want to just encourage you all in the chat if you'd like to send some appreciation to Rebecca for joining us today. And also share, if you're already not part of our Max community, we do encourage you to join us. As a member, you get access to webinars, Max Mondays, the resource library, the spotlights, Max Academy minutes, talks, network building. And if you would like to learn more about how you can become a member of Max, you can scan that QR code or reach out to Joy. She can help you with that. And then our next Max Minutes will be coming up on July 24th. We're working on finalizing that topic for you all, so stay tuned. And then lastly, Leadership Max Class of 2027, the application will be open for that in August of 2026. So those details will be coming. Stay tuned. And it is 10 o'clock. So thank you all so much for joining today. Again, thank you to our anchors, and I appreciate everybody's time.